My name is Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell, and I am a researcher with the Digital Benefits Network, a project of the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. For this session, we are joined by three panelists: Jordan Burris, Head of Public Sector Strategy at Socure, as well as Dr. Stephanie Schuckers, the Painter-Krigman Endowed Professor in Engineering Science in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Clarkson University, who is also the Director of the Center of Identification Technology Research, or CITER. And finally, Andrew Stetner, Deputy Director for Policy at the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization at the U.S. Department of Labor. That was a mouthful, but we're very excited to have you all here, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel. So during the morning sessions, we had the opportunity to hear a lot about how identity theft impacts individuals and communities. And I think this conversation will give us a chance to continue thinking about individual and group impacts, particularly as we think about solutions for identity proofing. So, as is likely familiar to our audience, as more of our transactions and interactions with both government and private companies move online, there are new risks both for organizations and for users. Companies and government agencies have responded by instituting new safeguards, including remote identity proofing solutions. However, some of these approaches do not work equally well for all users, as was illustrated during the pandemic very starkly when unemployment insurance programs instituted new identity proofing requirements for claimants in response to unprecedented levels of organized fraud. Some fraud detection strategies and identity proofing tools can disproportionately exclude low-income users and people of color. Identity proofing tools, which incorporate biometric approaches like facial recognition in particular, have raised concerns about performance bias in currently available technologies, as well as fundamental questions about data security, privacy, and accountability. Tackling these underlying questions about privacy and data use is also important for building equitable approaches to identity proofing. And I think it's important to underscore that the identity proofing challenges faced by government programs mirror the identity proofing challenges in the private sector. So today, our conversation will focus on the challenges of designing and implementing identity proofing solutions that address equity and bias concerns, and paths for architecting approaches to maximize inclusion. Over the next half hour, our panelists will share their perspectives from their work in private industry, government, and academic spaces. And we hope to leave time for a very brief Q&A session at the end. So yeah, with that, let's dive right in. My first question for our three panelists is really to set the tone for this conversation and what this looks like in practice. So I'd love to ask, how does bias happen in identity proofing? And what are the impacts when identity proofing processes do not work equally well for all individuals and groups? And in your responses, I'd love to get a sense of how, in your own work, you're addressing identity proofing issues. Jordan, can you kick us off?
Yes. So you had to wait a few minutes for it to cut on. Yes, absolutely. And so, I've had the pleasure in my career to work across public sector and private industry. I even served formerly within the federal government working on identity issues from a policy perspective and driving towards better approaches and implementation. In reality, when we look at U.S. identity and how it's approached, I think there was a question asked in the back towards how it's, there's different parts and pieces that folks are being asked to manage and orchestrate. The reality is that U.S. identity infrastructure, as we see it today, is broken. It's been fragmented for a long time. And a lot of the foundational elements that are associated with constructing what is a sound, secure digital identity that can be used seamlessly, it is incumbent on more of a partnership in our current ecosystem and model in order to manage those identities at scale. The problems that we see in bias a lot of times comes down to the reality that we continue to take an approach where we are not necessarily solving for the whole of the population, we're solving for the majority of the population. And as such, the minority or those who operate on the fringes are being left out of the ecosystem. The reality is that when we look at the US or just society in general, right, humanity is diverse. And as such, our digital identity solutions must be intersectional and being able to reach individuals where they are and representing their lived experiences and the outcomes that they're seeking to drive. And so with Secure in particular, we are an identity verification and fraud prevention company. And our focus is helping to promote more accurate and inclusive identity verification for those online. The challenge that we see in the work that we're doing today is helping to close the gap in what is the online channel in particular. And the reason why we focus in on that, and we serve a number of other channels as well, is that usually when folks can't get through the online process, they are kicked to something where it would be in person, having to go show up, waiting on, as we heard earlier, phone lines in order to try to assert what their identity is in order to move through the process. The reality is the way the technology has evolved, if you're actually solving for the challenges that we see related to those being left out of the population, you can bring more folks in through those online mechanisms, therefore giving them the ability to get the access to the benefits, services, goods that they need faster without having to jump through hoops ultimately to live their lives.
So, I come at this from a couple different hats. Of course, the hat is the academic, looking at the research aspects, but also through the work with the FIDO Alliance. And so, in particular, where most recently we've been putting our focus is on the biometric performance piece. Certainly you can't read a news article about biometrics without some statement about bias that's in the next or in the sentence with a biometric. And so I think one of the perceptions then that brings is that biometric recognition, and when I speak about recognition, I'm speaking about a very specific thing, right? A comparison between two measurements from an individual, a physiological or behavioral measurement, right? And so what the perception that comes of that kind of language is that it's inherently biased, right? That it's built in. If you do biometric recognition, there will be bias, right? Which is, I think the kind of thing we want to move past, because there are ways to assess those systems to determine where the biases are, right? And so now the kinds of things we can assess don't necessarily hit everything, and I certainly would acknowledge that, that people and organizations run these programs, right, which also have inherent biases. So doing a performance assessment doesn't necessarily take everything away, but it certainly takes a component of it away from the technology part of the component. And so what are the tools and things that we need to be able to do something like that? Well, of course, NIST has taken leadership, and some other organizations and academics around in terms of, algorithmic piece of it, right? Which is one important piece, but it's not the only piece. So now there's also the operational aspects to it. DHS&T with some of the work they're doing actually use those biometric recognition algorithms in a real use case, in a real environment, right? Because, simple things like, cameras, right? And how they operate and how the person acts with that camera, either in an in-person event or a digital online event, make a huge difference in the kind of performance that you're going to see. And so it's not enough to say, okay, it's been NIST tested, right? Now you're taking it into a very specific use case with a set of conditions, with extra sensors and how it's all put together. So it needs to be assessed there. So then, of course, there's how you measure it, right? So ISO is working on a standard with metrics. So you've got a measurement now that looks at that would look within each group to see where there's differences. But then there also needs to be a statistical framework, because you measure anything, you're going to get variation. But is that variation within the normal variation, or is it without a statistical difference? And so there's people working on that, and certainly in our research team. Also developing confidence intervals and bounds and sample size calculations. And so now you've got that far. We're still not done yet, right? So now we've got, processes on how to do testing. metrics, statistics. Well, now we need requirements, right? And so requirements, allow organizations who are trying to do the right things and do all this stuff to be able to say, look, I did all this stuff and I've met a requirement, right? So that's, of course, challenging too, because what would a requirement be, right? And so this is a project that we started within the FIDO Alliance to start to discuss, what would be reasonable requirements. We have requirements for those who attended, some of the NIST and on 863, right? There are biometric performance metrics in there. We can do that, right? For at least that aspect of where we might see differences for individuals. And I'm almost done. I think I'm almost done. Okay, last thing is, of course, then it would be lovely to have a certification, right? That could put on top of it. So I will stop there. Got some more comments later. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me today and giving us this opportunity to talk about the Department of Labor's work on identity verification. And since you referenced, some of the experiences, let me start with a little bit of background about the work. The Social Security Act requires us for states to have a method to reasonably assure that those who apply for unemployment benefits are in fact the individual that relates to that Social Security number. And because of the high level of identity fraud, we saw during the pandemic, the Congress and the department kind of had to turn to our states to bring in higher standards of identity verification and identity proofing. In fact, the Continuing Assistance Act of 2020 required us to direct states to verify the identity of 7 million individuals at the time receiving pandemic unemployment assistance, and to do it very rapidly. And states had to turn to private vendors, for this and deploy those technologies, very quickly. And I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar, with some of the challenges that rapid rollout happened. The House Oversight Committee last year pointed to 14 states that they examined with wait times over 4 hours when people had challenges with the technology, and that they concluded that kind of experience for individuals without with language barriers, without strong broadband, really created an equitable barrier to access. So in response to those challenges, we did work to lay out to states a set of business requirements that they should do when they're going out to vendors, performance requirements, and the ability to really look with data at equity impacts in their tools, customer service data, in their tools. And I think this will continue to be a focus of us going forward. And as we help work with our states in the regular UI program to bring identity verification, identity proofing, more into a permanent status, we're going to be emphasizing that they need to really be careful with any vendor they're looking at. We're also looking at public solutions for identity verification. From our viewpoint, public solutions like login.gov, for example, which we are piloting, they have the advantage of imagining something that is at scale, that could be spread nationwide. They also have the advantages of a set of legal protections and data requirements for looking at equitable bias and equitable impacts of those technologies. So that's another benefit, we see, to login.gov. As we're, doing this work, we are balancing, and we've tried throughout the pandemic and going forward, kind of twin desires to be able to implement unemployment insurance in ways that protect against fraud. And there are sophisticated criminals, both individuals and rings, internationally, domestically, that are looking at unemployment insurance as a way to take from the taxpayer money, but also how we can do that in a way that we're also creating equitable access to benefits that are available. So we're trying to move forward, with those two areas in mind. And we think one thing that's been missing, in that is that real look in real time. We don't think there is yet a system out there that, given the current digital literacy and the current digital divides, that a digital identity proofing system that is that kind of vision you said, Jordan, in terms of equity. But we believe that they should get there the way. But if the states and the federal government use those systems, we need to have transparency into the way those systems are operating. And importantly, last thing, we believe, at least in this stage, one problem we had during the pandemic is we didn't have good off ramps. We want to, offer digital identity verification and ID proofing in the right circumstances, but we want to get people for those non-digital off ramps And we're looking at exploring additional ways where public locations are able to provide that proofing, and I think of this in another area. And one thing I would talk, would have this group think about what's that combination of digital identity verification and in-person identity verification that can move forward.
Now? Yes, great. Yeah, so thank you so much for this. That was really helpful opening. And we've started to already dig into this next question a little bit, but I like to keep exploring some of the specifics here. So I'd invite you all to talk a little bit more about what would it look like to architect identity proofing solutions that can maximize inclusion, and what are some of the challenges to getting there?
So, I mean, I'm happy to kick things off. And what I'll say is that when you start to look at the challenges, it's about understanding the differences that make up humanity in particular, right? I definitely appreciate a lot of the conversation related to biometrics in particular, but that is just one part of the identity equation. And ultimately what we far often miss is that there's many steps associated with being able to do the proofing process today. And ultimately we believe that identity verification of the process itself should be more progressive in the way that it is being rolled out. Today, what we see in a number of cases with legacy solutions, and Andy, I'm happy to talk more about how we solve for the future. But what we see with a lot of the legacy approaches that are being taken today is that they're very heavily reliant on these rule-based constructs. These rules-based constructs are predicated on the notion that I've seen someone and what good looks like for an identity based on how they present their information at the time they are opening an account or engaging for a digital service. That can lead into things like confirmation bias, folks who have profiles or things that are made up like me. For an example, I expect that the name that is associated with my driver's license it matches the legal identity, the identity that I go by, right? And this could be for those individuals who may have a legal name change underway for a whole host of reasons. In particular, if you have a system that is looking specifically for that aspect to be 100% match, in particular, it will reject those individuals. And so when you're not solving or identifying those things right out of the gate, you have an issue. When you're looking at folks from a physical transience standpoint, a lot of the population moves around, especially at the height of the pandemic, where even our own CEO moved from New York over to Nevada in particular. And what we found is that if you're not keeping up to date all those systems or areas where you've put your address information, you have the potential to leave someone out of the process where things just aren't matching. And if you're trying to look at where someone's geolocation is and do geofencing related to how they are presenting themselves because they just so happen to be on a beach at the time that they're trying to open an account, you potentially could inadvertently leave someone out. So it's about understanding all the factors that go into an identity, and then the opportunities that you have to solve for that. And of course I can go on, but I definitely want to turn over to some of my panelists so that way they can add their perspectives.
Well, I mean, I'll just add, let me talk a little bit more about our work, through login.gov and our working through the American Rescue Plan. In our, login.gov pilot, we're doing that in the state of Arkansas. It's not a state with a high level, of digital literacy, but we've expanded it from one part of the state to making it available across the state. This is a state that did not have digital identity verification in place. You had to go in person. It was the only option to verify your identity. It was a longstanding requirement. So they work with us to pilot this, but it's not perfect. And we are looking at the data on a real-time basis and seeing what the barriers are and seeing what adjustments can be made. Hopefully those adjustments to the technology, but also adjustments, to the business practices. I think our emerging, vision of this is that we have some combination of data analytics, cross-matching, and identity proofing together is what kind of constitutes identity verification. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, for everyone. We've tried to go in, at the same time, looking at fraud prevention and equity in our grants. We've given out grants to the states, in both areas. And one of our initiatives through our Tiger teams, we've kind of identified, have the state identify where their problem set is at and what kind of place that they can, impact and insert identity verification, in their business process and their tools. So we're kind of, putting these things on and challenging these programs to look at equity in a much more, conscious way. That for us is a very key element, of identity verification going forward. And this is, really in line with, principles across this administration. On the president's order, executive order on equity, the executive order on consumer experience. These are, things that we're moving forward in everything we're doing. I think this administration, we're looking at equity impacts, with data throughout our work in ways that really the federal government has never done so before.
So just to add to the various comments, it struck me as I was listening, we spent the whole morning talking about how, our identity system's broken, right? And so, and by broken, it, means that there are, that individuals who go through whatever steps we've put in place, for good reason, right? We don't want people's, identity to be stolen, and we also don't want fraud, right? They aren't very good, and I know a lot of people are working very hard to make them as good as possible, but it's because there's still that broken component, right? And so because they don't work very well, there's going to be more inequities is bottom line, right? But I think what's exciting, right, is because of all the innovations that I'm hearing, both on the public sector side as well as the private sector side, on how we can do better, right? Certainly legislation will help, right? But the innovations are already happening, right? Kinds of things that you were talking about, and some other organizations, in terms of providing, authoritative sources that you can bounce against, right? That the things that are happening in biometrics, with what the congressman brought up, in terms of encryption, where you can do calculations in the encrypted space without unencrypting the biometric information, and thus, right, providing another honeypot, right, of biometric data that can be used against you. And certainly, I can't go to any talk to not talk about liveness, right, and presentation attack detection, and the fact that one of our goals is to connect, right, that carbon-based person to that digital thing, right? And so that is a combination of matching, but also that key step that there's a real carbon-based person, as part of that connection. And as we do, more and more, as the threats, right, they're going, the threats are going after the low-hanging fruit, right? And so we got to keep upping our game in terms of what we're doing in these systems, and of course there's the deep fake threat, right? Which is emerging, and the ability for AI to simulate real individuals. But there's also a lot of work in terms of, what are the things we can do to detect those kinds of attacks and challenge response, back to that, making that connection between the carbon-based person and the digital piece of it. So it's a super exciting time, right? To be part of this work. And I think by getting better tools and reducing, the mistakes that those tools make, right? Then we'll be better off in terms of ensuring better equity and access for individuals.
Thank you all. I have one more question before we open up for Q&A. And Andrew and Jordan, I think you've already started to get into this a little bit in terms of digital literacy and other obstacles to using online services and identity proofing tools. But identity proofing processes can be opaque to users, whether that's opening a bank account or applying for a government program that has some kind of verification step in place. And it seems possible that lack of understanding or transparency could create inequities and also potentially consent issues. And so I'd love to hear from you as our panelists what you think the responsibilities of industry and government are to explain how these tools function and are being used. And also, in particular for you, Stephanie, what is the role of academia in creating dialogue and public understanding around these technologies and tools?
I can jump into that. I think a couple of things, come to mind. First of all, one of our initiatives is around plain language. And I think if you look at these systems, there's an education bias and who can make their way through them. So putting things into, the proper, literacy level and education level that's needed to make it through. Education is also correlated with a lot of the challenges, that Jordan was talking about. changes or flags or things that could come up. But we think that's, a key usability, feature. We are trying to really bring in user testing and user experience to the central of our work around technology development and modernization, and have that to be a continued, feedback loop. And we also think, in talking to the private sector, one of the biggest problems we had was, what's the customer service behind these tools? We want them to get better, continually to improve, but we need to have, ability to be able to talk to a customer service representative in a reasonable amount of time. We are emphasized with our states that also for us, and that's why the public sector can be important. We will have due process rights if their identity is questioned, given notice, and some of the old technologies are real helpful here. U.S. mail. U.S. mailing something to someone's an address that someone has been known to live at, and they can respond and bring in their documents, to a physical location. That can be a really critical off-ramp. And I just want to tell you in my research where we're at in America, and I appreciate the representative and his comments about digital literacy and where we're at. But as we think about different generations, I remember in some of my research working with a woman, and she was saying, look, the only reason I have an email account, the only reason I ever use a computer is once a year when my factory shuts down in January, I have to file for unemployment benefits. And I would never be able to do it if I didn't have everyone around this table, her fellow union members, to walk me through every step. And so we had to realize there's still a lot of people like that out there in America today. And so we have to have the right kind of customer service processes, the right kind of due process, in these tools. And, one thing we saw certainly during the pandemic, and I think as we'll continue to see, within, our work as states are working with private vendors, they're not always building those tools, in place at scale, especially when they're rapidly expanding. And it's really something that needs to be built in, from the beginning in any tools that you're offering, especially when you're working with a public sector partner.
I'll take it from two different lenses in particular. The first being in like the tools and technologies that are being used in particular. So, the thing that powers how we approach identity is predictive analytics, and more importantly, being able to build machine learning models based on an identity string in particular. For that, we're identifying various variables associated or aspects, characteristics associated with an identity, and then in some cases doing testing to identify areas where we have to neutralize that variable and whether or not that is impacting a particular socioeconomic group for any known number of reasons. I would say that vendors should be willing to put their research and the data, the analysis that they're performing related to the subject, make it available to their customers such that they understand what exactly is happening in that space, and particularly with government in particular. For us in particular, we walk our customers through disparate impacts for various changes that get made based on implementing our particular models. And then to take it a step further beyond the tool set in place, looking at how we are increasing the dialogue about opportunities to improve the process overall. And what I mean by that is it would be amazing if we could publish what would be our performance rates for being able to verify parts of the population or do something. We call it auto approval, but it's the notion of, can you get someone through the process without requiring some type of human or manual intervention ultimately? And human intervention can come in a number of factors. And, we should all be striving for the highest rate in particular, right? If we're actually able to have a realistic conversation in public sector, be able to highlight that level of transparency, then you can see the differences where various solutions are being implemented, where you're not achieving, high level of rates, where you're achieving, 60 to 80%, maybe on a good day, approval rates versus what would be the ideal 95%, where then you're focusing on the 5% of the population that may not be able to get through your predominant mechanism or predominant channel. And instead they're the ones that actually don't have the identity evidence. They actually do not have the device that allows them to get through those parts of the problem. But unfortunately, we've taken this approach where complacency is okay, and we're not willing to be, I guess, really open about what needs to change there. And so I would say it definitely needs to come in twofold, right? What we're doing and putting out to the public about our performance and what looks there, and then also talking about what study analysis data is being used to analyze our existing solutions, how they're comprised, and making that available to the government as well, such that they have visibility into where there are opportunities for improvement.
And so in terms of the role of academia, certainly, as part of the research center, given the mandate for our center is to work with industry and government on solutions. What we've done is to figure out where the gaps are, study those gaps in our research projects, and then try to translate that into not only technology, but also kind of usable things, for industry. So it's been great to work with the FIDO Alliance. So we started with the biometric component certification. Now we have the IDWG group, which has the document authentication certification that was just released. I think Andrew's going to be talking about this more later today. And as I said, we have some work projects, around looking at bias and what possibly we could do there. So that's kind of one way, what academia can engage, is to look at these solutions. So right now, as I said, it's about biometric recognition, just your comments there, right? Like not everything is about that, right? So there are these other channels, right? So which are giving the correct answer. It just so happens that it's disenfranchising a certain group, right? So the question is, so should we even be considering that variable, right? And so how can we sort of take it to the next level, right? To these kinds of other kinds of solutions that we can identify, and then what can we do to help industry, figure out those things so they can do the right things. So they want to do the right things. They want the help, right? To be able to do the right things. The other aspect is about education. Of course, we educate our students at the universities that are our partners, but we've also started work. We do work with the Biometrics Institute. They also do look at responsible and ethical use of biometric recognition. So look at the work they do, and we've just put out a draft infographic, around sort of many different use cases for biometric recognition to help tackle sort of the confusion around, well, if I use a biometric for my iPhone, does that mean I'm going to be surveilled, right? In the square here, right? And so sort of talking about the different use cases and where the data rests and who uses the data, and just to give kind of a framework for the discussion to allow a more nuanced conversation. So take a look at those graphics, and things like authentication versus identity proofing, et cetera, et cetera. And then last, we have a video series of animated video from our CIDR affiliates, in particular DHS S&T, who help sponsor those videos. And I have a slide, so with the QR code, but basically it's on the YouTube under CIDR. If you just say CIDR, you probably won't find us. So CIDR biometrics, and lovely, thank you. Looks like they're getting the slide queued up, and watch it so that way people will hit it. The more views, obviously, the more likely it is in a search. So please, everybody, if you don't mind going and watching it, just so we can improve our ranking. But we have one particularly on bias, right? That we just posted, and so I will be sending it out over LinkedIn, and so please forward and have people and it talks about some of the things that I was covering in my comments today. So there we go.
Well, thank you all so much. I want to be mindful of the time, and great to see the slide up here. But I think if we have a few minutes to open it up for questions from the audience. I think there's one in the back.
Hi, Kit with NBC again. When you are making decisions about which tools to use and keeping equity and access in mind, has there been any kind of side-by-side comparison of how these tools affect populations? Like, it seems like there's a lot of speculation, a lot of effort to take care when choosing these tools, but I've been looking for that kind of information and I can't find it anywhere. So I'm curious if that effort is going on behind the scenes, and if not, how decisions are made about which tools to use.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start off with in public sector in particular. I would say that conversation does not happen the way in which it should today. We actually published, and it's available on our website, a digital identity, inclusion, and fairness report, where actually we did a side-by-side performance. Now, we didn't talk about who we were going up against at that moment in time, but we did a side-by-side comparison and our ability to get different parts of the population through. In that report, we were able to demonstrate for various parts of the population, 18 to 25, Generation Z, Blacks, Asians, elderly individuals across the board, we were able to demonstrate lift. And this wasn't something that we just put out individually. It was actually validated by our customers at that moment in time. And so the capability to do these things, we do data studies like this all the time, in particular because we view identity as a math problem. It's a data science issue, and we really need to be focusing it more on that lens. It is available, but it is not used widely enough within public sector. And there's definitely building blocks towards being able to take that type of approach. I talked a little bit from the transparency standpoint. There's also the ability to share information internally with the agencies in some cases, but then also with vendor community in order to have kind of the more robust conversation and, to adopting more of this data science mindset when it comes to identity challenges. And then you're able to identify where there are disparate impacts.
No, I would say we think that's a gap. And as I talked about before, it's something we've already put in our guidance to the states that they need to be doing that, asking the vendors to do that. And once they purchase a product, be collecting that data and use it to analyze it. And it's something we're going to be even stronger on as we go forward. The pandemic was a rush situation, but now we're looking forward, and it's a huge priority for us and for this administration.
Yeah, and I'll just add to DHS&T has posted their next biometric rally. Is going to be focusing on the document authentication piece of it, and also I think there's been RFI information from GSA on some of the work going forward, and of course what we were talking about in FIDO. So things are happening.
And if I could just ask one follow-up, what are login.gov's pass rates?
I don't know those off the top of my head, and I think we're still evaluating our own usage, of it.
Any other questions?
Thank you. So how much of the problem is continually having to go through the process instead of having, oh man, I finally got through it once, they know who I am, now you go to someplace else and you got to do it again?
For me, I'm going to say that the reality is it depends on the user or the part of the population in which you are engaging with, right? I think to Andrew's point on the individuals who basically only engage in government processes or the ability to verify who they are once a year, that's quite a bit actually of the population. I usually pick on my family, mainly because they're not here to throw tomatoes at me in particular. But for example, my father-in-law absolutely hates all technology. He hates having to have logins, and he actually prefers in some cases to just do it differently and then delete the account immediately after. In particular, there's a lot of things going on in that frame. My wife actually serves as power of attorney over my brother-in-law, and she actually has to sit side by side for him for a number of these things in particular. And in a lot of cases, they have to re-up the application process each year. So it actually requires them to create, in some cases, new accounts in order to engage within the ecosystem. And so a lot of it is, again, depending on the part of the population that you're talking about. Some of them are in favor of reuse. Some of them are not in favor of reuse. Some of them don't want to even be known, want to be off the grid in particular. I think it's important that there's optionality that is available, that we're able to meet people where they are ultimately, and giving them the best path to get through the process such that if they are asked to reproof or re-identify, verify who they are, they can do so in a manner that is seamless, it is simple, and it is quick. Right? Because the number one reason why folks aren't getting through the process today, at least is my personal belief, is because when they can't get through the process, they start to abandon it because they don't want to wait in queues. They don't want to wait in call centers. They don't want to take weeks, months, years in order to get through the process in particular. So if we're able to solve that upfront part of the process, make it simpler for them, then you're going to see higher rates of adoption. But again, that's my personal theory on the matter.
Yeah, I think one thing we're looking at it is, we see that not just verifying it more than once, but having to re-verify can be a big problem. And we have to figure out better solutions for and design better tools. Very frequent situation. Apply for unemployment benefits 5 years ago. You come back in, log in. I don't know my password. I don't have the same cell phone again. And when I call, I can't get through. So we have to figure out, we have to try to design these systems in a better way that we don't have those continual breakages, that we have with systems. So I do think re-verifying, is a big issue. And that's why I really appreciate the Congressman's, remark. Whether it's a national digital ID or secure state IDs, something through your phone, we're not there yet, but it's really attractive to get there because in the absence of that, we're just in a very fractured system, which we think is super hard, for a lot of people.
Well, I would like to thank our panelists. This is coming online, my microphone, but I'd like to thank our panelists for an excellent conversation. I think these are really important issues, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with the three of you about them. Yeah.